Namaskar and welcome to Sansad Television. I am Vishal Dahiya and you're watching our show Perspective, where we bring you details of key national and international issues. Today we're going to talk about the Ukraine-Russia conflict. Now, representatives from both Russia and Ukraine held sixth round of peace talks in Turkey earlier this week in a bid to bring an end to the ongoing conflict, which began on 24th of February this year. While both sides termed the dialogue process as meaningful and constructive, the trust deficit still remains. Peace negotiations will now resume in online mode from 1st of April. Ukraine is proposing to abandon its long-standing ambition to join NATO and wants legally binding security guarantees. This was discussed at the latest round of peace talks, with Russia proposing to scale down its military offensive towards Kiev. Ukraine, however, says that there has been no let-up in the Russian military action on its capital city. Meanwhile, the first meeting of US-EU high-level dialogue on Russia was also held in Washington on Wednesday to consider further steps to isolate Russia from the US and EU economies and the international financial system as well. So in which direction is the Russia-Ukraine conflict headed, and what can be expected from the peace talks between both sides? To try and understand all these aspects, we're joined by a distinguished panel of guests today. Let me first introduce them to you. Beginning with, we have with us Mr. Dmitry Trenin here. He's director of Carnegie Moscow Center in Moscow. We're also joined by Mr. Ajay Malhotra, ex-ambassador of India to the Russian Federation, and Professor Harshvi Pant is also with us, head of the Strategic Studies program at ORF. Welcome, all of you gentlemen, to Sansad Television. I'll begin with you, Mr. Dmitry, and let's start by understanding your assessment of, the moves which are being made by both sides, Russia and Ukraine, towards the peace process. And also, do they match the action taken by both sides on the ground? And in those terms, how tangible do you believe the achievements which are expected from this peace process are?
Well, thank you very much, first of all, for the invitation to join this esteemed panel. I would say that the negotiating it's not negotiations per se at this point. I think it's more of talks, more of contacts between Russian and Ukrainian officials. As you said, it's the sixth round of those discussions, and it's the first one in several weeks that the two delegations actually met face-to-face in Istanbul. Mm-hmm. There's very little movement in those talks. The only thing that registers, at least in my mind, is that for the first time, Ukraine, as you said in your opening remarks, in writing, confirmed its willingness to abandon its bid to join the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and instead seek guarantees, security guarantees from a number of countries. There are other matters included in the Ukraine paper, and they have been transmitted to the Kremlin, and they are studying this whole thing at the Kremlin. Mm-hmm. But I must tell you that there is very little likelihood that any kind of settlement can be reached in the foreseeable future.
Okay.
I think that, as you said also, hostilities continue on the ground, and I would say that it is the progress of those hostilities, or maybe progress is the wrong word, the result of those hostilities in the next few weeks, mm-hmm. that would put us closer to answering the question, is a settlement possible, and what kind of a settlement?
Okay. That seemingly explains a lot of things, but still, few aspects are a bit more complicated than what they look like. I'll bring in Ambassador Malhotra here as well. Ambassador Malhotra, what we need to understand, and if you could help us understand in the ways, the Kremlin strategy perhaps from here onwards would be, because it has been almost more than a month of conflict between both sides. And if we look at what Russia is doing on the ground and what it says in the peace process or the negotiations dialogue process which is going on, and on the other hand, Ukraine as well, letting go of some key points which of course have been Russia's major demands, but sticking to few of them still.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. Yes, First of all, I would like to point out that in my view, I think we've got a long way to go before we reach a peace which is durable and which would provide security guarantees for both sides. Because only if you comprehensively address the concerns of both Russia and Ukraine would you really be able to sort out this issue. At the moment, the process is with both sides getting a better appreciation, understanding of each other's position.
Okay.
As to how long will it take, I think it will take some more time for sure, because even if you look at eastern Ukraine and Donetsk and Luhansk, whereas Luhansk has largely been brought under Russian control or under the control of the Luhansk People's Republic, as it's known. Donetsk is, it's not yet happened in Donetsk. You have largely freed up Mariupol from the Azov and other forces that are there. But I think till that happens, you would find the push continuing and discussions going to and fro and more rounds taking place. There are some positive indicators, but even where Ukraine is now suggesting they also want security guarantees, so both sides are looking for security assurances. But even the suggested guarantors have not yet have been giving sort of negative messaging as to whether they're willing to take that on, given that Ukraine is not a member of NATO. So this whole process will take some time. If you don't sort out the situation in Donetsk and Luhansk from a Russian viewpoint, I don't think you have reached a position where you can talk of a peace agreement being concluded.
Okay, and that list of guarantors is pretty long, which Ukraine has mentioned. In fact, two of them are non-NATO members as well, China and Israel. There, of course, their view on that also will be really important. We'll come to that point as well. But let me bring in Professor Pant here. Professor Pant, from your point of view, if we have to understand the major hurdles or obstacles here, because first and foremost, Ukraine seems to be giving up on its ambitions to join NATO. That was something which Russia's, a prime point was as well. But again, as Ambassador Malhotra is pointing out, it wants legally binding security guarantees as well. And those guarantors, there seemingly is no sort of word coming in from them as well so far.
Yes, Vishal, thanks. I think, this NATO and Ukraine's desire to join NATO, of course, has been a long-standing one. But I think the fundamental point there had been Ukraine's strategic autonomy to decide which way it wants to go. Now, of course, it is talking of neutrality. It is talking of neutrality under certain conditions which are satisfied, and whether that can be the precondition for a larger peace process between the two, between Russians and the Ukrainians. But I think, as others have pointed out, this is about large-scale restructuring of the European security architecture. This is not simply a contestation between Ukraine and Russia. This is, if you go back from where it started from the sense of alienation that Russians felt. And then, of course, now it's the other way around. It's the Ukrainian sense of insecurity that will continue to drag on. So unfortunately, I think unless you have the essentials in place, you will not have a sustained peace or sustainable model for peace, because we are in a situation where Russia may have demonstrated its willingness to take on, to use violence or to take on military means to pursue its strategic agenda. But at the same time, Ukrainians have pushed back and given a sense that, look, there are certain deadlines that they're also not willing to cross. Okay. So in a sense, between this Russian and Ukrainian juxtaposition, the entire European security architecture is being negotiated. So it's going to be a long-standing discussion. And a very, I think, long one, perhaps, before we can come to conclusion. And I agree that I think more than anything, it's the realities on the ground that would determine, and military realities on the ground that in the end would determine what kind of a settlement ultimately emerges. Because as we are, every day the military situation is changing. Okay. And military Russia has not been able to get a decisive victory in any of the theaters. So that means that the flux continues on the ground, and it will continue to have an impact on the way these negotiations proceed. Okay. So a bit of a fluid situation out there. And of course, the hard realities on the ground will dictate as to which way the peace process will move as well. It'll
take time as well. But let me bring in Mr. Dimitri here. Mr. Dimitri, from the negotiations point of view, or from the talks point of view, as you're saying, we can't still call them negotiations. Both sides are trying to understand each other's context here as well. But Ukraine's offer of, being a neutral state, letting go of its ambitions to join NATO, and asking for legally binding security guarantees as well. What's Kremlin's viewpoint on that? Is that enough, or that's not enough?
Well, that's clearly, if you read the Kremlin's stated objectives for this ongoing operation, this is clearly not enough. There are other things that Russia feels very strongly about. One of those things is demilitarization, meaning essentially reducing the size and capacity of the Ukrainian forces so that they do not pose a threat to Russia, that Ukraine does not host foreign bases in its territory, does not engage in military assistance programs with foreign countries, it does not seek to overturn its non-nuclear status. I think this is something that the last thing is something that Ukraine has already been willing to agree to. But and then there is this issue of denazification, meaning the exclusion of far-right elements from the Ukrainian political system and Ukrainian social system, I would say. Also, Russia is seeking Ukraine's recognition of Donetsk and Lugansk, the two oblasts in the east of the country that declared their independence many years ago, and now Russia recognized those territories as independent states. So Russia now wants Ukraine to recognize that independence, as well as the independence of Crimea, which since 2014 has been a republic within the Russian Federation. That said, I think that on the issue of Ukraine's political military status, i.e. Neutrality, non-bloc status, non-nuclear status, there is a fair amount of agreement between Moscow and Kiev.
Okay. So that explains another set of important aspects there. Mr. Malhotra, I'd like to bring you in here on the aspect which Professor Pant referred to in terms of the regional security structure as well. Professor Pant is pointing out that it's just not about Russia versus Ukraine. In fact, this entire conflict will bring a lot of fundamental changes in the European security structure there, and also an add-on point which we would like to understand is will there be a spillover effect in other regions also?
Well, I don't know about spillover effect elsewhere, but certainly for Europe, there is a requirement. If you see, both sides are now asking for security guarantees. So clearly you need to do something. Something has gone wrong up there. And what that is, if you look at the various treaties that were in position up there, all of them have been dropped by the wayside or disowned. The INF Treaty, the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty, etc. So in a larger context, we have to look at all of that again. And that adds to the insecurity that both Russia and Ukraine are facing. So, I think you would have to do some other work beyond just making sure that no bases are provided to foreign states in Ukraine and no military exercises are taking place without the approval of whoever those guarantors might be. The main concern for the Russians has been that this should not serve as a source or a base from which missiles and other weaponry can be fired at Russia. Okay. In particular, nuclear weapons, I think on Ukraine's non-nuclear status, I do hope there is now agreement once again. But if you recall, on 19th February, President Zelensky speaking in Munich had spoken of reopening that as an issue. And that might well have been a precursor which led to the Russians a few days later thinking, well, we better now step in before these things go too far down the road. So there's a need to look at many other things. It's not merely what needs to be done up here. There are changes that are taking place elsewhere. For example, Switzerland, in Russia's neighborhood, Finland and Sweden joining in and providing armaments, etc., and looking at their status, etc. I think a lot of careful thinking needs to be brought to bear, and consideration given to what kind of structure you need for Europe. And it's not merely the North Atlantic Treaty, which and the North Atlantic Alliance that should determine this. The concerns are there for every country. Even a neutral Ukraine has concerns beyond Russia, I do believe. There are parts that used to belong to other countries before, Poland, Romania, Slovakia, etc. And even for Russia, if you see, there are concerns. So maybe when you do sort this out, the whole conflict between the two of them, you would, for a durable peace, you would need to go beyond. I do agree with Professor Pant up there that some broader consideration of how to address security in Europe in general needs to be given by all European parties. This is simply not acceptable.
Professor Pant, what do you think in terms of what these nations, which also have a stake, now we're talking about the European security structure as well. Of course, all the European nations will be the affected parties in that context there. And the other major powers as well, which are being mentioned by Ukraine also in that legally binding security guarantee, which it's mentioning. So what is it that they need to do from here onwards to help scale down this conflict?
Well, Vishal, this is going to be something which if you observe the arc of this crisis carefully, you would see how, in some ways, some kind of reassessment is happening at multiple levels. Of course, the crisis started off by Russians trying to reassess their own relationship with Europe and what perhaps they need to do to have their own sort of imprint on the security architecture. And of course, Ukraine became part of that discussion. But if you look at the response to this in Western Europe in particular, and Mr. Malhotra, Ambassador Malhotra was mentioning a number of these countries, we have seen now a newfound desire to make NATO more relevant, to make NATO more robust, to a lot of these countries who were till yesterday not part of NATO, now wanting to become part of NATO. So I think there is a broader reassessment already happening in Europe, which I'm not so sure as to what direction it takes us from here, because it clearly seems that the fault lines are hardening. And the Russia versus the West Western Europe fault line is becoming much more potent in ways that we have not seen in the past. And those assumptions about European security, on which I think a lot of the world grew up post-Cold War, they are being reassessed. And of course, you have the role of China in particular that you have talked about, I think, and for Russia also an important relationship there, for Ukraine an important stakeholder, as you mentioned, in terms of where the larger geopolitical alignment actually goes from here, Russia, China, and the West. So I think there are huge questions, entangled with this basic conflict between Ukraine and Russia that we'll have to disentangle, and that the policymakers will have to disentangle, because otherwise you end up into this security loop, where the security dilemma never goes away, where everyone is insecure, where for a region that thought that geopolitics is over, which is Europe, we are now bang into the era of geopolitical contestation, and somehow that old idea of spheres of influence, of how do you make sure that that rivalries are contained, great power rivalries remain contained with all the basic paraphernalia. All those questions have come back in a way that we have not seen in the last 3 decades. So I think essentially we are looking at at a fundamental reassessment happening, and I am not yet sure as to the direction that this is likely to go. It can also go in a direction that perhaps the Russians did not envision when they started it off. It is at the moment, as I said, there is a lot of flux in the system. There are fundamental questions being reassessed, and the policy postures of all stakeholders are being reassessed. If you look at a country like Germany, for example, squarely at the heart of Russia, redefining its security and political posture at a time of great turbulence, one of the most striking developments of this crisis. So I think all nations, from the small neutral ones to big powerful ones, recalibrating their positions, and this will have a great impact not only on Europe but also on the larger global geopolitics.
Okay. Quick concluding comments from you, Mr. Dimitri, before we bring this to an end on the role being played or to be played by these other stakeholders, the other European nations and the big powers as well, the other global powers.
Well, I think if you look at the situation from Moscow, you're mostly fixated on the role played by the United States and the American policies, American designs, American strategies vis-a-vis Russia. The conflict has grown way beyond Ukraine, not in the military sense. In the military sense, it has been contained to Ukraine, and there's a fairly good chance that it will stay within Ukraine. However, this conflict has transformed the confrontational relationship between Moscow and Washington into an overtly hostile relationship. I would call the current situation a hybrid war between Russia and the combined West. And it's not only about Ukraine. I think it's about Russia's policies, Russia's not only Russian foreign policy, but Russia's domestic policies and politics as well. So this is extremely serious, and it's not just foreign policy, because the sanctions that have been imposed on Russia have the objective of essentially strangling the Russian economy and bending Russia to the will of Washington. And clearly, Russia would resist that. So it's not going to end with Ukraine. It's as I said, this is extremely important, and I agree with Professor Pant. It really affects much of the rest of the world.
Okay. So it has a larger context there as well. Thank you so much, Mr. Dmitry Trenin, Ambassador Ajay Malhotra, and Professor Harsh Pant as well, for sharing your views and insight with our viewers. As our experts were pointing out, of course, there is a peace process or dialogue process which is underway. 6 rounds have taken place. But there is a trust deficit as well between both sides, Russia and Ukraine, and much of the peace dialogue process is being dictated or directed by what happens on the ground, wherein the situation is very volatile and flux as well. But there are other stakeholders and other factors as well which play a very important part, and that is the stand or the posture being taken by the other European nations and other world powers as well. We'll keep a close watch on all the developments here and keep on bringing you all the details. Till then, keep watching Sansad Television. Thank you.